A black CEO boarded the plane with a first-class ticket that had been purchased weeks before. But the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, skeptical eyes swept over him as if he had wandered into a place where he did not belong. No noise, no argument, just a cold denial that froze the cabin. If it were you yet when you were doubted, even when you were right, how would you react? Would you step back in silence or stand up for your dignity? Would you choose to protect the peace or protect yourself? In that moment, he was faced with a choice no one wants to face. Let injustice continue to repeat itself, or dare to touch the truth that many people avoid. Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged just because of your appearance? Do you remember how heavy that feeling was? Come with me on the journey of a man who did not choose to fight with a scream, but with a calmness strong enough to shake an entire system. If this story touches you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can start to step into this powerful story. The morning sunlight over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport carried a soft haze, the kind that made every reflection on the terminal windows glow gently. Travelers moved through the concourse with the familiar rhythm of an early weekday flight, steady, tired, but hopeful in a small, unspoken way. Somewhere among the footsteps and the rolling suitcases came the quiet, composed steps of Marcus Gray. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He wasn't loud. He didn't wear the kind of suit that sparkled or shouted success. His navy jacket fit him neatly. His shoes were polished but showed faint creases near the ankles, the honest marks of a long work week. A half-finished cup of airport coffee warmed his left hand. His right hand carried a worn leather briefcase, old, reliable, and real. That was Marcus, a man who preferred things real. He paused near gate B47 and exhaled softly. It had already been a heavy week, 2 overnight meetings, 1 tense negotiation, and a last-minute security briefing. His shoulders carried the exhaustion, the kind only executives with too much responsibility ever truly knew. But even in his fatigue, his presence had a weight of calm, a stillness that came from surviving enough storms to know the value of quiet. Marcus didn't fly first class because he loved luxury. He flew first class because it was the only time he got to sit still without the world tugging at him from every direction. And because after the childhood he had promised himself he would never again shrink to fit someone else's expectations. As he approached the first-class boarding lane, he remembered his father's voice, a voice he hadn't heard in 25 years but still carried like a compass. Son, when people look at you and see less, don't you dare look at yourself and see less. Marcus gave a faint smile at the memory. His father had been a mechanic, hands rough, voice steady, a man who worked hard his whole life but was once turned away from a country club when Marcus was 9. Members only, the guard had said. Marcus remembered how his father simply placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezed gently, and walked away without arguing. He never forgot that walk, or that squeeze, or the bruise it left on a little boy's understanding of the world. Maybe that was why Marcus always walked a little straighter now, a little firmer, a little quieter, but never smaller. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it without issue. First class. Seat 2A. The agent confirmed with a pleasant smile. Marcus nodded, thanked her softly, and stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the cold filtered air felt sharper. The leather seats glowed under soft white lights. A few passengers were already settled, scrolling on their phones, reading newspapers, or quietly assessing the new arrival in that subtle, evaluative way people in first class often did. Marcus didn't mind the looks. He'd learned long ago that curiosity wasn't always hostility, and besides, he knew where he belonged. He walked towards seat 2A, placed his coffee down, and reached to store his briefcase overhead. That was when he heard her voice. It clipped the air like a cold blade. Sir, first-class passengers only. Marcus turned slightly. A woman stood in the aisle. Helen Morris, the chief flight attendant, mid-40s, blonde hair pinned tightly, uniform crisp and flawless. A polite smile that didn't match her eyes. Marcus spoke calmly. I am a first-class passenger. Helen didn't even glance at his ticket. Instead, her gaze ran over his face, his skin, his simple briefcase. A quick scan, a judgment made in under a second. Sir, you must have taken a wrong turn. Coach is behind you. A few passengers looked up from their phones. Someone in row 3 narrowed his eyes, as if silently agreeing with her. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. Marcus let the moment breathe before he answered. I'm in the right place, he said softly. C2A. Helen's smile stiffened, the way a smile does when it's trying to hide irritation. May I see your boarding pass? She asked. Now louder, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Loud enough to send a message. Marcus nodded. He handed her the pass. She glanced at it for half a second, not long enough to read anything, then handed it back. This looks unusual, she murmured. I'll need to verify it with the system. Marcus felt an old ache stir inside his chest, an ache he had learned to silence through years of practice. I checked in at the counter, he replied. Everything was confirmed. Helen was already shaking her head. These things happen, she said. Sometimes people print the wrong tickets. Sometimes upgrades don't go through. I've seen it many times. Her tone carried something deeper, a suggestion, a story she was writing about him in real time. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't sigh. He didn't let the heat in his chest grow into anger. He simply stood there straight, steady, grounded. Behind Helen, a woman in seat 1C lowered her newspaper. She was older, late 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly and a soft lavender sweater resting on her shoulders. Her eyes held warmth and recognition. Marcus acknowledged her with a tiny nod. She nodded back, slow and kind. Sir, Helen said again, now with the firm tone of finality. Please step aside so we can verify your ticket. Her voice floated through the cabin, settling on every listening ear, a quiet humiliation taking shape. Marcus inhaled gently, grounding himself the way his father taught him. Breathe in truth, breathe out their noise. I'd prefer to stay at my seat, he said. Helen blinked in disbelief. That won't be possible. The cabin grew still and the air felt thinner. Marcus felt every stare pressing on him like small, invisible weights, some curious, some annoyed, some quietly satisfied. He placed his briefcase on the seat deliberately, respectfully yet did not sit down. He remained standing, not out of defiance, but out of dignity. That was when the woman in seat 1C finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, but carried through the cabin like a soft bell. He belongs here. Helen stiffened. Ma'am, with all respect, I can handle this. The older woman's gaze did not waver. I'm sure you can, she said. But I've flown this airline for 30 years. I know a legitimate first-class ticket when I see one. Her words dropped into the quiet like small stones into still water. Helen's jaw tightened. A crack of irritation flashed across her face. I need to follow protocol, she insisted. And Marcus, still calm, still tired, still very human, felt that internal shift. That quiet moment when you realize the day is about to become heavier than you had planned. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Not again, he thought. Not another moment where someone looks at me and sees less. But when he opened his eyes, the calm was still there. He wasn't 9 years old outside a country club. He wasn't his father walking away with a broken voice. He was a grown man, a leader, a black CEO who had built something that mattered, and he would not shrink today. Not this time. The quiet in the cabin settled in a way that felt unnatural, like everyone was holding a breath they didn't know how to release. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence, soft and steady, but under it was something else, a tension that clung to every surface, as if the air itself had leaned forward to watch. Helen Morris stood in the narrow aisle, shoulders lifted slightly, chin raised with a kind of brittle confidence. Her hand rested on the edge of the seat as if she needed something to steady her posture. For a moment, her expression flickered between irritation and uncertainty. A brief tremor that passed so quickly most people would have missed it. Most people, but not Marcus. He noticed details he always had. When you spend a lifetime walking into rooms where you are measured before you open your mouth, you learn to read people long before they read you. He could see Helen wrestling with something beneath her professional tone, whether it was embarrassment, defensiveness, or something older and harder to name. He could not tell. All he knew was that she wasn't stepping back, a clear sign this moment was far from over. Behind her, the older woman in seat 1C, Ruth Campbell, watched closely. Her silver hair caught the cabin light, giving her the kind of presence that didn't come from volume but from a life fully lived. She folded her newspaper on her lap with deliberate calm, as if preparing to speak again if needed. Helen tapped her small tablet. The screen glowed faintly, reflecting in her eyes. She frowned. The device froze for half a second before coming back to life. She cleared her throat and spoke with an edge sharper than before. It seems your ticket needs further verification. Please step aside while I contact the gate. Her voice carried across the section. Someone in row 3 shifted loudly. A man with a business suit leaned toward the aisle, muttering something under his breath that Marcus couldn't fully hear but could easily interpret. A few other passengers exchanged looks that hovered between discomfort and approval. Marcus kept his posture relaxed, hands at his sides, voice even. You've already looked at my ticket. He paused just long enough to let his words settle. It's valid. Helen's polite smile returned, thinner this time. Our system disagrees. Sometimes the scanners misread. It happens. Her tone had that familiar shade, the one Marcus had encountered in boardrooms, at conferences, at hotel lobbies, and at more than one airport security checkpoint throughout his career. A tone that dressed itself as procedure but carried the weight of pre-made judgment. Before he could respond, a quiet voice near the back of the cabin rose just slightly. The words came from a young man, soft and unsure, barely above a whisper yet caught in the stillness of the space. They're recording this. Marcus glanced over his shoulder. A teenager sat 3 rows behind, holding his phone low as if trying not to draw attention. His face held a mixture of worry and determination. The live stream had started. Marcus didn't mind cameras, but he didn't need them. What mattered was dignity, not attention. But something about the boy's presence, the tremble in his fingers, struck a chord deep inside Marcus, a part of him that had once been young and unsure, watching his own father shrink in front of a guard who never bothered to know his name. He inhaled deeply, letting the air sit in his chest for a moment before exhaling slowly. I would prefer to remain where I am, he said again, calm and steady. Helen reacted instantly. That is not an option, sir. Her voice rose, enough that it reached the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft. A few faces peeked through as the curtain shifted open slightly, curious eyes scanning the tension like spectators at the edge of a brewing storm. Helen continued, If you refuse to comply, I will need to inform airport security. You are obstructing the boarding process. A ripple of murmurs traveled through the cabin. Words like stubborn and causing trouble floated in the air. Suspicion traveled faster than truth. Marcus felt the familiar sting beneath his ribs. It wasn't sharp. It was the slow, steady ache of recognition. The same ache he had felt when a hotel manager once assumed he was the driver for his own board meeting. The same ache when a vendor greeted his white colleague as the CEO, even though Marcus had been the one making the final decisions. A lifetime of subtle wounds. None fatal, all unforgettable. He placed his hand gently on the back of his seat. He didn't grip it. He didn't lean on it. He simply made contact, grounding himself. I'm not obstructing anything, he repeated, with a tone that held nothing but quiet certainty. A woman across the aisle looked down at her hands. A man loosened his tie, maybe out of discomfort, maybe out of guilt. No one spoke up, except Ruth Campbell. The older woman closed her newspaper completely now, folded it once more, and placed it on the seat beside her. Her posture straightened, and her voice, though soft, carried the weight of someone who had spent decades teaching others how to speak with clarity. Helen, she said, I watched him board. He scanned his ticket like every other passenger. There was no issue. Helen's smile stiffened again. With respect. Ma'am, I need to do my job. Ruth met her gaze, unwavering. Your job is to uphold procedure, not prejudice. The words landed with a gentle impact, but an impact nonetheless. The kind that didn't raise the temperature but shifted the entire room by a few degrees. A few people inhaled sharply. Someone whispered. Did she just say that Helen's face flushed slightly? She stepped back, breathing through her nose, trying to maintain control of the narrative. This is not personal, she insisted. Marcus held her eyes. That, he said quietly, is exactly why it's personal? For a moment, even the air seemed to hesitate. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't match her stiffness. He simply spoke truth in its simplest form. And truth, when delivered without anger, could be far more striking. Helen took a step away, tapping her tablet again, though her hands were not as steady as before. I'll call for verification, she said. Please remain where you are. Marcus watched her turn and walk toward the galley, heels clicking sharply on the cabin floor. Each step carried the brittle rhythm of someone who believed they were right yet feared. Deep inside, they might not be. He lowered himself slowly into his seat. For the first time since boarding, he allowed his body to sink into the leather, though not completely. His spine remained straight. His eyes stayed open. The teenager continued recording. Ruth Campbell looked at Marcus with gentle apology, as though she wished she could undo the last 5 minutes. Marcus offered her a small nod. He understood. He always understood. Because the hardest part of moments like these was not the humiliation itself. It was recognizing how familiar the humiliation felt. The hum inside the first-class cabin began to change. It was no longer just the low vibration of the aircraft's engines or the quiet rustle of passengers settling in. It was something heavier. A quiet unease that moved from seat to seat, as if the entire cabin sensed a line had been crossed but didn't quite know how to name it. Marcus Gray sat still. Not stiff, not defiant. Just still. His hands rested easily on his knees, his breathing even. Eyes focused on the space in front of him rather than the stairs circling around him like drifting clouds. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply trying to exist in a space that was supposed to belong to him as much as anyone else. Yet somehow, this simple act felt like an intrusion to others. The young man with the phone, Jaden Brooks, shifted in his seat. His grip on the device trembled slightly, but he kept recording. His voice, low and uneasy, reached Marcus through the quiet. They're checking your ticket again. People online are already commenting. It wasn't the words that made Marcus turn slightly in his direction. It was the tone, a mixture of disbelief and sadness. A tone Marcus had heard before from younger co-workers who realized, perhaps for the first time, that the world sometimes judged a man before letting him speak. Marcus gave him a nod, not of approval but acknowledgement. A subtle gesture that said, I see you. Thank you. Footsteps approached from the front of the cabin. Helen Morris returned with another staff member, a younger attendant whose nervous eyes darted between Marcus and the passengers. Helen held the same tablet from earlier, though now her fingers pressed the screen with more force than before, as if the device itself was to blame for the moment, spiraling out of her control. Sir, Helen said, our system still shows a discrepancy. I'll need to verify your boarding pass again. The words felt like déjà vu, but somehow sharper. Each repetition cut a little deeper. Marcus reached for the slip of paper resting on his tray table. He handed it over calmly, though inside he felt the faint tightening in his chest that came whenever he was forced to justify his presence. The tightening wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was memory. The memory of all the other times he had been asked to prove himself while others were simply trusted. Helen scanned the ticket again. A faint beep sounded. The screen flashed green, but she frowned as if waiting for it to turn red. When nothing changed, she tapped it again. The younger attendant leaned closer. It's valid, he whispered. Helen shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. She cleared her throat. I'll have to scan it one more time. Her tone held something brittle, like glass tested too many times. This time, even the passengers reacted. A man across the aisle shifted and muttered, "Is this really necessary?" Someone behind him sighed heavily, and yet someone else whispered, "There's always something with these situations." The sentence drifted through the air like a hint of smoke. Marcus heard it. He didn't react. His face remained calm, but inside there was a quiet stirring, a small echo in his chest, the kind that reminded him of standing beside his father outside that country club, hearing adults make assumptions they never bothered to hide. Helen finally lowered the tablet. "Sir, I'm calling the gate again. Please wait." She turned and walked briskly toward the front cabin, shoulders tight, posture rigid. A few passengers avoided looking at Marcus altogether. Others stared openly, as if waiting for him to become the problem they had already decided he might be. Ruth Campbell lifted her teacup, took a small sip, and set it back onto its saucer with steady hands. Her eyes met Marcus's. There was kindness there and something else, too. A kind of sorrow. The sorrow of someone who had lived long enough to recognize injustice not by its noise, but by its repetition. "You're handling this with remarkable composure," she said softly. Marcus offered her a small smile. Experience. Ruth nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. Jaden shifted again in his seat. His voice carried from behind. "They're saying online that this shouldn't be happening. People are watching. Like, a lot of people." Marcus exhaled quietly. He didn't relish the attention. He didn't crave the validation. He didn't need to go viral to justify his worth. All he wanted was clarity. A simple acknowledgement of the truth he had already presented. Moments passed, long enough for the whispers to turn into a quiet ripple, the kind that travels through a crowd without needing words. At that moment, Helen returned accompanied by a taller man with sharp features and a neatly pressed uniform. He wore a name tag that read Samuel Rogers. There was a firm steadiness to him, but his eyes searched the scene with an awareness that suggested he could already feel the tension in the air. "Mr. Gray?" he said with a tone far calmer than Helen's. "I'm here to resolve the situation. May I see your boarding pass?" The request was polite, but still a request Marcus had heard too many times today. He offered the ticket once more. Samuel scanned it. A soft beep. Green light? No alarm. No error. He scanned it a second time. Same result. He looked at Helen. "It's correct." Helen barely blinked. Samuel continued with measured care. "There appears to be no issue with Mr. Gray's seat assignment." Helen tightened her jaw. The system flagged it earlier. She insisted, "I'm only following what the protocol requires." Marcus sensed the shift. This wasn't about procedure anymore. Procedure had already been satisfied 3 scans ago. This was about Helen trying to protect the story she had written in her mind. A story where he didn't belong in the seat he had paid for. Samuel cleared his throat gently. "Protocol requires accuracy," he said, "and accuracy shows this ticket is legitimate." The atmosphere in the cabin changed again. A few passengers leaned back, whispers dying down. Someone murmured, "Good. Let him sit." Another person nodded quietly. Even so, the unease didn't fade completely. Helen held the tablet tightly, as if it were her last anchor in a situation slipping beyond her control. She turned toward Marcus with restrained tension. "Sir, I'll need to make one more call to confirm with the gate before I can allow you to stay in this seat." This time, the words hung in the air longer, heavier. A moment passed where nothing moved. Then another moment. Marcus felt something inside him shift. Not anger, not pride. Something deeper. A fatigue that wasn't physical but emotional. The fatigue of always having to prove yourself to people who had already decided you were a mistake. He spoke softly. "Ms. Morris, you have scanned my ticket 3 times. Your colleague has scanned it twice. Your supervisor has scanned it twice more. That is 7 verifications?" A murmur moved through the cabin. 7 sounded absurd when spoken aloud. Marcus continued. How many more do you need before you believe it? The silence that followed felt like the entire cabin braced itself. Helen's face stiffened. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her control over the situation had cracked, and for the first time, she didn't seem entirely sure what to do next. Ruth Campbell set her teacup aside. This has gone far enough, she said firmly. Marcus looked down briefly at his hands. They were steady, his breathing steady, his voice, when he finally spoke again, carried the calm of a man who had learned to fight battles without raising his arms. I will remain in my seat. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a lifetime. The cabin fell into a stillness that felt almost sacred. Everyone sensed it, even if they couldn't name it. The moment when patience stopped being compliance. The moment when quiet became resistance. Marcus sat tall, and this time, not a single person asked him to move. The stillness inside the cabin no longer felt like ordinary quiet. It carried a weight that touched every passenger in a different way. Some looked down, unsure of their own thoughts. Some shifted in their seats with a discomfort they didn't want to name. Others looked at Marcus with a new awareness, as if realizing they had been watching something far more meaningful than a simple dispute. Samuel Rogers remained near the front, arms at his sides, expression thoughtful. The way he studied Marcus suggested he was seeing more than a passenger refusing to move. He was seeing the deeper wound beneath the moment, a wound he did not yet fully understand. Helen Morris stood a few steps away, breathing unevenly, her eyes fixed on her tablet screen. She tapped it again, uncertain whether she was looking for a system error or a justification for her own assumptions. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. For the first time since the confrontation began, she appeared unsure of herself. Jaden Brooks lowered his phone a little, uncertain if he should keep recording. His mouth parted as if to speak, but he hesitated. Part of him feared making things worse. Another part felt a pull inside him, a thought he couldn't shake. If he didn't document this, who would believe it? Marcus sat quietly, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes steady. He knew this moment was about more than a seat. It wasn't even about this flight. It was about something older and heavier that followed him everywhere he went. Something that other passengers could walk away from, but he could not. Yet he didn't resent them for that. He simply wished they understood. Ruth Campbell leaned forward, placing her hands gently on the armrest. Her voice reached him in a soft tone that carried a lifetime of wisdom. Just breathe. Mr. Gray. Sometimes dignity works more quietly than people expect. Her words did not fix anything, but they did offer something steady to hold on to. A small whisper drifted from the back. She's calling security. Passengers turned toward the aisle as Helen lifted her radio. Her voice trembled slightly but remained loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. This is Flight 1083 requesting ground security at the gate. Passenger verification unresolved. The message lingered in the air like cold wind slipping through a doorway. Several passengers exchanged glances. A few tensed. One man let out a frustrated breath. Another covered her mouth with her hand. The tension had grown into something unmistakable now. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was confrontation. Samuel stepped toward Helen, his tone careful. Helen, we may not need to escalate this. Her reply came fast, almost defensive. The protocol says unresolved verification requires ground support. Samuel exhaled slowly. We verified 7 times. I'm protecting the airline, she insisted. Her voice carried a strain that made her sound less like a professional and more like someone clinging to a rope that was slipping from her grasp. Jaden raised his phone again, hands steadier than before. The live stream comments scrolled across his screen so quickly he barely caught more than glimpses. Outrage, shock, encouragement, people urging him to keep going. His heart pounded, yet something inside him had settled. a sense of responsibility he didn't expect to feel. Marcus kept his gaze forward, not defiant, not afraid, simply present. He did not flinch when Helen's radio crackled with a confirmation. Ground security dispatched. A hush fell over the cabin, a hush that carried judgment, a hush that carried guilt. The man in seat 3A sighed and shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he murmured, though he didn't say it loudly enough to be counted as standing up. Ruth Campbell closed her eyes for a moment, her hands clasped lightly, fingers intertwined, as if holding an old memory she wished she could forget. She spoke without looking up. "My husband once told me something," she said softly. "He said prejudice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the voice of someone who thinks they're doing their job." The cabin absorbed her words. They landed differently for different people. Marcus heard them as truth. Helen heard them as accusation. She stiffened, lips pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Campbell, I'm not doing anything wrong." Ruth opened her eyes, calm and unshaken. "You're right, Helen. You're doing something familiar. There's a difference." Helen swallowed hard. Her face flushed a deeper shade. Her tablet lowered a fraction. For the first time, she seemed to ask herself a question she had avoided since the start of this ordeal. Not, is he wrong? But why did I assume he was... Before she could answer it, footsteps approached from the cabin entrance. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Security had arrived. The younger officer scanned the first-class section. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern, as if he wasn't sure what situation he had walked into. The older officer, broader and more authoritative, moved with a sternness that had been shaped by years of dealing with unpredictable passengers. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some straightened. Some shrank back. Some exchanged guilty glances. The older officer lifted his chin. "Where is the individual in question?" Helen stepped forward. "Seat 1A." Her voice wavered ever so slightly. Marcus looked up at them, his face calm, his posture steady. "Good evening," he said softly. There was no trace of fear, no trace of anger, only a quiet truth. The younger officer blinked, taken aback by Marcus's composure. Helen held out the tablet. "This passenger's ticket may not be valid. We've been unable to confirm..." The younger officer interrupted gently. "How many times was it checked?" His tone was not accusing, just curious. Helen hesitated. 7. The cabin reacted before security did. A few passengers gasped. Someone whispered, 7 times. Another muttered, "This is embarrassing." Samuel stepped in. Every scan confirmed the ticket. Every single one. The older officer studied Marcus for a long moment. He seemed to recognize something in the man's stillness. Not defiance, not threat. Something quieter. Something grounded. "Sir, do you have your identification?" Marcus reached slowly into his jacket. He moved calmly, deliberately, in the practiced way of a man who had learned long ago that sudden movements could be misread. He handed over his ID. The older officer inspected it. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He read the name again. Marcus Gray, founder and CEO of Gray Shield Technologies. He exhaled through his nose. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not awe. A deeper understanding. He looked at Helen. "This man is a CEO. The ticket matches, the ID matches. There is no violation here." Helen opened her mouth. The system flagged. The officer raised a hand, not unkindly, but firmly. Sometimes systems reflect human error. He handed the ID back to Marcus. "My apologies for the disruption, sir." Those words fell like a stone dropped into a still lake. The ripples moved outward, touching every passenger in sight. Marcus nodded slightly. "Thank you." Security stepped back. The older officer spoke quietly to Helen before leaving. She listened, shoulders tightening, jaw trembling, but she said nothing. As they exited, Jaden's livestream caught the moment, and whispers of relief moved through the cabin like a slow release of pressure. Ruth Campbell gave Marcus a gentle smile. "Sometimes justice needs a witness," she said. Marcus looked ahead, expression calm yet distant, as though he were holding a quiet ache behind the stillness. He knew this was far from over. Something deeper had shifted, inside the cabin, inside Helen, inside himself. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was anticipatory. The story was only beginning. The officer's departure left behind a strange quiet. Not relief, not closure, but the kind of stillness that follows a strike of lightning before anyone understands what has truly happened. The passengers settled back into their seats, though their eyes continued to drift toward Marcus as if the moment had left a small imprint on each of them. Samuel Rogers remained near the aisle. He looked toward Marcus with a contemplative expression, as if trying to reconcile the simple truth he had witnessed with the disorder that had caused it. His posture was respectful, perhaps more respectful than before. Helen Morris stood a few steps away with her tablet pressed against her chest. Her breathing had become shallow, her gaze restless. The officer's words had rattled something inside her. She had expected confirmation, reinforcement of her decisions. Instead, she had been confronted with the weight of her own assumption, and it shook her more deeply than she would ever admit aloud. She whispered something under her breath, not loud enough for anyone else to decipher. But Marcus caught the anxious tremble in her voice. He did not take pleasure in it. He simply recognized it. Recognition carried no triumph for him, only a quiet heaviness. Jaden Brooks had lowered his phone again. His live stream had paused, though the camera still hovered in his hands. His heart thudded in an uneven rhythm. Part of him felt guilty for filming. Another part knew people needed to see this, that truth sometimes needed witnesses who were brave in simple ways. Ruth Campbell placed a hand gently over her folded newspaper. "Moments like this," she said softly to Marcus, "don't disappear. They linger." Marcus offered a small nod. "I know." He kept his voice warm, though something tight had settled in his chest. A familiar echo from years of being questioned in quiet ways that looked harmless from the outside, but left marks in places no one could see. Samuel stepped closer, choosing his words with care. "Mr. Gray," he said, "if you need anything, please let me know." There was sincerity in his tone that had not been present earlier. A sincerity born from witnessing what the officers had acknowledged in seconds. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you." "Mr. Rogers?" Helen's eyes flicked toward Samuel, then toward Marcus, then away. The room had shifted around her, though she stood in the same place. The quiet lasted only a moment before a soft chime echoed through the cabin. A message flashed on Helen's tablet. She tapped the screen tentatively, her eyes scanning something unseen to the others. A frown touched her forehead. She tapped again. The device froze. The screen flickered. She turned to Samuel, her voice thin. "My system isn't responding." Samuel stepped closer, leaning in to look. "Mine is fine." He glanced at her device again. "Try the reboot." Helen pressed the button. Nothing changed. Another attempt. Still nothing. Her breath grew uneven. "I don't understand," she murmured. A second chime sounded. This time it came from the overhead speakers. A compressed digital tone, not the usual boarding announcement. The lights above the aisle flickered once, very faintly, as if the aircraft itself exhaled. Passengers straightened. "What was that?" someone whispered. "Probably nothing." Another replied, though the uncertainty in their voice betrayed their words. Marcus remained still. Inside him, something shifted. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. He knew the sound. He knew the timing. He knew the quiet tremble in the cabin networks that preceded system interference. He did not move. He did not speak. But deep behind his composed expression, he sensed a change unfolding far beyond this aircraft. Helen tapped her dead tablet again, her voice cracking slightly. Samuel, something's wrong with our network. He pulled his own device from his belt. His screen lit up normally. He checked an internal system panel. Everything appeared stable. Your device might have crashed, he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Jaden lifted his phone again, uncertain whether the moment was significant or not. A comment from earlier replayed in the back of his mind. He's the CEO of a cybersecurity company. He swallowed hard, eyes drifting toward Marcus. Ruth watched Marcus with her calm wisdom, sensing something beneath the surface she could not yet put into words. Another chime, this one sharper. Then a brief pause in the overhead ventilation hum. Marcus closed his eyes. Just for a second. He had built systems that protected entire corporations from collapse. He had seen what happened when those systems detected attempted breaches. He understood the patterns of disruption when a network entered defensive mode. And this felt familiar. A crew member entered from the curtain separating the cabins. Samuel, she said, my device just froze. The passenger manifest won't load. Samuel took a breath. Could be a temporary glitch. The chime echoed again, this time accompanied by a faint stutter in the cabin lights. A ripple moved through the passengers. Not panic, not yet, but an unmistakable shift in collective awareness. Marcus opened his eyes, steady and unshaken. He didn't look at Helen. He didn't look at Samuel. He looked straight ahead as if something unseen had entered the cabin with quiet steps. Helen's voice rose behind him. What's happening to our system? The words wavered. A man in row 3 raised his phone, frowning. My airline app just crashed. Someone else spoke up. Mine too. Another voice. I can't access my ticket. Samuel attempted to remain calm. Everyone relax. This is likely a server sync error. But his own tone betrayed doubt. Jaden's phone vibrated. He glanced down. His eyes widened. The live stream chat is exploding. People are saying the airline's app is down nationwide. The word nationwide drifted through the cabin like a slow, widening ripple. Helen turned pale. That's impossible. Marcus spoke gently. His voice held no triumph, no sharpness, just a quiet truth that filled the space between every seat. Systems respond to pressure. Sometimes they push back when the human element goes too far. Helen's breath caught. What are you saying? Marcus kept his gaze forward. I'm saying the airline's infrastructure may have detected a conflict. One created right here. Ruth placed a hand lightly over her heart. Dear God. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The lights flickered again. The hum returned. Then another chime. Marcus remained still. He did not touch his briefcase. He did not touch his phone. He did not touch anything at all. His stillness carried more weight now. It felt intentional. It felt powerful. Samuel stepped forward. Mr. Gray, do you know what's happening? Marcus paused before responding. His voice emerged quiet, steady, almost soothing. I think your system is telling you the truth long before any of us are ready to face it. The cabin felt smaller now. Not claustrophobic, just close. Everything had shifted. Silence had broken. Control had turned. And no one understood how deeply the moment had changed. Except him. The subtle tremor in the cabin lights faded. But the unease it left behind remained suspended in the air. No one spoke for several long breaths. Even the ventilation hum seemed to hold back, quieting enough for the tension to settle into every corner of first class. Helen Morris pressed her fingers against the edge of her tablet as if willing the frozen screen to return to life. Her eyes darted from device to device, searching for a sign that this glitch was something she could explain, something she could control. But every attempt to wake the tablet only reminded her how powerless she had become in a matter of minutes. Jaden Brooks leaned forward, whispering into his phone as the comment feed flickered. They're saying flights across the country are delayed. Some airports can't check passengers in. This is something big. His voice trembled with awe and fear in equal measure. A man in row 3 looked around with disbelief. How can every system fail at the same time? Ruth Campbell breathed slowly, holding the armrest with grace. Her eyes drifted toward Marcus as if she sensed a storm forming just outside the cabin window. Samuel Rogers approached Marcus, his tone lowered and respectful. "Sir, is there something we should know, us?" Marcus lifted his gaze, calm and almost serene. "That depends on what you believe," he replied quietly. The answer made Samuel pause, not because it was evasive, but because it held a depth he wasn't prepared for. Marcus remained still, hands resting on his knees. But beneath his steady posture, his thoughts moved with precision. He understood the signals. He recognized the pattern in the overlapping failures. These were not random glitches. They were network-level responses triggered by conflict, by protocol escalations, by stress indicators logged from crew terminals. Someone somewhere had pushed the system too far, and now the system had pushed back. A soft vibration buzzed in Marcus's jacket. He didn't reach for the phone immediately. The vibration continued once more, persistent but measured. Jaden noticed the sound. "Mr. Gray, I think someone is trying to reach you." Helen stiffened. Her head snapped toward Marcus, suspicion and confusion tangling together. "Who is calling you at a moment like this?" Marcus didn't answer her. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and drew out the phone with quiet control. The screen displayed a name that made the space around him shift in an invisible way. CEO Richard Hanley, National Airlink Headquarters. Passengers around him inhaled sharply as the name lit up the screen. Even those unfamiliar with the aviation industry recognized a corporate title when they saw one. The weight of it settled like a new layer of tension. Helen's voice cracked. Why would the CEO be calling you?" Marcus looked at her, not with triumph, not with challenge, but with an expression so calm it unsettled her more than anger ever could. "Because I built the infrastructure that is failing right now." The sentence dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Ripples spread through every person who heard it. Ruth's eyes widened with quiet realization. Samuel's breath caught. Jaden's phone nearly slipped from his grasp. Helen's knees almost buckled. Marcus accepted the call. Marcus Gray speaking. Richard Hanley's voice burst through the phone in a strained, breathless rush. "Marcus, tell me you can hear me. We're in full disruption mode. Booking systems, identity verification, gate syncs. Everything is locked out. I have directors shouting. Airports calling us nonstop. The federal office is demanding answers." He paused to breathe, then spoke again with urgency. "Marcus, what is happening?" Marcus rested his elbow on the armrest. His voice came out steady, softer than expected. "I believe your system is responding to a misuse of authority." Silence hit the line. Passengers could hear Hanley swallow. "Is this connected to Flight 1083, he asked slowly. Marcus glanced at Helen, then returned his eyes to the window. "Yes." A low murmur swept through the cabin as if the truth had brushed across every seat. Hanley's voice returned, quieter but heavier. "The system triggered a sector quarantine. That only happens when—" He hesitated. "When human error compromises the fairness algorithm." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Hanley exhaled sharply. "Marcus, what did my crew do?" Marcus turned his head slightly. He didn't look at Helen with anger or reproach. His gaze was simply steady, almost sad. They questioned a valid ticket again and again. They acted on assumption rather than procedure. They escalated a harmless situation into a security concern. Hanley cursed under his breath. "Marcus, can you restore the system?" The question did not surprise him. He allowed a small pause before answering. "It's not about restoring it. It's about understanding why it shut down in the first place." Hanley's tone tightened. "If we don't get this fixed, the entire network will stall. I need your help." Marcus breathed in, then released the breath slowly, letting the quiet linger for a moment. "I'll help," he said. "But not until we address what happened." Helen flinched as if the words had struck her. Hanley asked, "What do you need?" Marcus lifted his chin. I need acknowledgement that the system reacted to discrimination, not malfunction. Passengers shifted in their seats, absorbing the weight of his request. It wasn't a demand for revenge. It wasn't humiliation. It was truth. Hanley's silence stretched long. Then came the words that changed the air. You're right. Helen's breath trembled. I'll contact the federal board. We'll issue a formal acknowledgement. And I will personally speak to the crew involved. The air seemed to settle around Marcus. He nodded once. When that is done, I will restore your network. Hanley's voice softened. Thank you, Marcus. You're the only one who can... The call ended. Another kind of silence filled the cabin. Not tension, not fear. Something else. Awareness. Awakening. Marcus placed the phone gently on the armrest. His eyes remained calm, steady, present. Helen stood rooted to the floor, her world shifting faster than she could understand. Her voice escaped her in a whisper. You shut down the entire system. Marcus looked up at her. No. I designed a system that shuts itself down when it detects injustice. Her eyes welled. Passengers watched with quiet astonishment, some with admiration, others with shame, but all with new understanding. Marcus leaned back, the soft leather wrapping around him like a long overdue acknowledgement. The balance of power in that cabin had quietly turned, and no one could pretend otherwise. The cabin no longer felt like the same room it had been moments earlier. Every breath seemed quieter, every heartbeat heavier. Even those who had not spoken a word throughout the ordeal now watched Marcus with a kind of stunned reverence, as though they had witnessed something too large to put into simple language. Helen Morris stood frozen near the bulkhead. Her tablet remained pressed against her uniform, the dark screen reflecting a faint shimmer of cabin light. She looked smaller now, not because anyone had diminished her, but because she had begun to see herself clearly for the first time in years. Her voice slipped out in a thin thread. I never meant for this to happen. Marcus lifted his gaze slowly toward her. His expression didn't carry anger. It didn't carry triumph. It carried something far more disarming. Honesty. I know you didn't intend harm, he said softly. But harm doesn't need intention to exist. Helen blinked hard. Her fingers clutched the edge of her useless device as if it were an anchor she no longer trusted. Jaden Brooks had resumed recording, though the camera trembled faintly. His live stream was filled with comments that surged so fast he could no longer follow them. People were calling the moment historic, unreal, painful, necessary. He swallowed, unsure whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed that he had become the witness for so many strangers watching the story unfold. Ruth Campbell placed her hands on her lap, her posture straight, her presence steady as a lighthouse. Her voice flowed with gentle strength. Helen, she said, sometimes the hardest truth is realizing we didn't see what was right in front of us. Helen's breathing faltered. The older woman's tone held no accusation, only compassion. Compassion, she realized, was far harder to face than anger. Samuel Rogers stepped forward. His voice was low but firm. It's not too late to do the right thing. Helen looked at him, eyes filling. I thought I was doing my job, she whispered. Samuel shook his head gently. Sometimes doing the job means recognizing when the job is wrong. The words pierced the cabin with quiet clarity. People shifted, some nodding, some staring down at their hands, confronted by their own memories of moments when they stayed silent. Marcus folded his hands together. He breathed slowly before speaking. I've seen people make mistakes. I've made my own. But refusing to see them. That's what scars a system. Helen pressed her lips together as tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Not from shame alone, but from the sudden realization of how many small assumptions she had allowed to build inside her over the years. Assumptions that had just brought an entire airline to a halt. Jaden's voice rose quietly from behind. They're saying online that Mr. Hanley is already drafting a public statement. Helen closed her eyes. A statement, she murmured, as if the word carried its own sting. Because of me. Marcus turned toward her with an expression that surprised everyone. Compassion softened his features. Not pity, not forgiveness. Something more patient. You didn't break the system, he said gently. The system was already broken. Tonight it simply showed you where the cracks were. Helen's breath shuddered. She lowered her gaze, finally seeing what she had refused to face earlier. She had not been protecting anything. She had been afraid of losing her illusion of control. A chime sounded overhead, not sharp or alarming this time. A soft tone signaling a message redirected from the aircraft communications channel. Samuel checked his handheld device. The airport gate display had vanished, replaced by a blank screen. He cleared his throat. It looks like ground operations are asking the crew to remain in standby mode. They're waiting for Mr. Gray's signal. The words hung in the air with new meaning. The balance of power was unmistakable now. Not because Marcus had seized it, but because he had never needed to. Someone in row 4, a middle-aged man who hadn't spoken a word since boarding, raised his voice hesitantly. Mr. Gray? Were you always able to do something like this? Marcus turned slightly toward him. I never wanted to. That matters. The man nodded slowly, as if letting the weight of that answer settle into his understanding. Jaden lowered his phone for a moment, wiping a trembling hand across his jeans. Something about witnessing this in real time made him feel older, as though he were seeing adulthood in a new, sobering light. People online think you're doing this to get back at the airline, he said softly. Marcus looked at the young man with a calm kindness. If I wanted revenge, I wouldn't be sitting here. Revenge is loud. Change doesn't have to be. Ruth's eyes softened. Something in her expression glimmered with quiet pride. You carry yourself like a man who understands the cost of dignity, she said. Marcus nodded. Dignity always has a cost. Sometimes the cost is patience, sometimes the cost is pain. Sometimes the cost is silence. A long pause followed. Then he added softly, but silence can turn into action without raising a single voice. Helen took a trembling step forward. Mr. Gray, I'm sorry. Truly. Her apology didn't come with excuses or conditions. It came heavy with the weight of someone who had finally looked into a mirror she had avoided for far too long. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement. Not forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement. That alone made Helen swallow back another wave of tears. The cabin lights steadied. The hum returned to its full rhythm. The aircraft seemed to breathe again, as if sensing the cabin had reached a fragile but important alignment. Samuel's device chimed again. Ground control is requesting an update, he said. They're waiting for Mr. Gray's decision. The entire cabin felt the shift. Passengers leaned forward, eyes fixed on Marcus. The atmosphere held its breath. He looked around the room, taking in every face. The strangers who had become witnesses, the strangers who had become part of a moment that none of them would forget. He finally spoke in a tone that was steady, warm, and resolute. I'll restore the system. Helen exhaled, almost collapsing with relief. But Marcus wasn't finished. After one condition, he added gently. Every head turned. Every breath paused. He looked at Helen with calm sincerity. We start by telling the truth. To your team, to the airline, to the public. No excuses, no cover. Helen held his gaze, her voice trembled. I understand. Ruth smiled faintly. Good, she whispered. Marcus rose slowly from his seat, carrying the calm authority of someone who didn't demand power, but simply embodied it. For the first time since the ordeal began, the cabin didn't feel divided. It felt aligned, and every person in it sensed they were standing at the edge of a moment that would shape not only what came next, but everything that would follow. The story was no longer about a seat. It was becoming something much larger. Marcus remained standing for a moment, hands relaxed at his sides, letting the cabin absorb the weight of what he had said. The passengers followed his movements the way a room follows a lighthouse beam, not because he demanded attention, but because something in him drew people toward clarity they had forgotten they needed. Helen Morris took a slow step back, giving him space. Her breathing softened, though her hands still trembled around the edges of her uniform. She felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, revealing truths she had buried beneath habit and procedure. Samuel Rogers gave Marcus a respectful nod, waiting for direction. In his eyes was a blend of admiration and unease, as though he understood the rarity of witnessing a moment where dignity outweighed protocol. Jaden Brooks lifted his phone, unsure whether he should continue recording. His thumb hovered over the screen. A voice inside him whispered that the world needed to see what came next. Another voice wondered if filming this man's pain and strength felt too intimate to broadcast. Marcus noticed the hesitation and gave him a small, reassuring nod. "You can record," he said softly. "Truth deserves to be remembered." Jaden swallowed and steadied the phone. Marcus reached into his briefcase, not with urgency, but with a deliberate calm that felt almost ceremonial. He lifted a slim laptop, its matte black surface absorbing the cabin light. Passengers leaned forward in their seats as if they sensed something important was about to unfold. He opened the laptop. A faint glow rose from the screen. No alarms, no digital theatrics, just a quiet hum, as if the machine itself recognized his touch. Helen watched with wide eyes, her voice barely escaping her lips. "You're really going to bring the system back on?" Marcus nodded once. "Restoring the system is the easy part." She blinked. "What's the hard part?" He looked at her with a still kindness, ensuring people never forget why it shut down in the first place. Her throat tightened. Ruth Campbell leaned slightly forward, her voice gentle. "This is bigger than a flight." "Mr. Gray?" Marcus nodded. "It always was." Samuel stepped closer. "What do you need from us?" "Honesty," Marcus said. "And patience?" He tapped a small security module with his fingertip. A quiet chime sounded, deeper than any cabin alert, vibrating with the weight of encrypted access. Lines of code appeared, flowing calmly across the screen like water gliding over smooth stone. Passengers stared, mesmerized. Some recognized nothing on the screen, yet they recognized the authority in his posture. Some understood enough to realize he wasn't just accessing a system. He was navigating something far more intricate. Helen gathered her courage. "Mr. Gray, what exactly is happening inside the network?" Marcus continued typing slowly, his voice low and steady. The system entered a defensive lockdown. It isolated its core functions to prevent harm. It isn't punishing the airline, it's protecting the public. Helen's eyes widened. "So you didn't do this?" Marcus shook his head. "No. The system responded to a breach of fairness. It responded to the human factor." Helen pressed her palm against her forehead as if the truth were heavier than she expected. "I triggered it, didn't I?" The question trembled on her lips. Marcus paused. The glow of the laptop reflected in his eyes as he looked at her. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only truth. "You didn't trigger it alone," he said gently. "It was triggered by a pattern. One you didn't create, but one you allowed to continue." Helen looked down, shoulders sinking. Passengers watched her quietly. Some felt sympathy. Others felt uncomfortable with their own memories of moments when they, too, had allowed something unfair to stand, simply because it didn't hurt them personally. The quiet stretched for a moment before Jaden spoke, voice cracking. "It's not just her, is it?" Marcus glanced at him. "No, this is about more than one person." Jaden lowered his phone slowly, his expression shifting into something thoughtful, something older. "Feels like all of us have seen something like this before," he whispered. Ruth nodded softly. "We have, child. Many times. Most of us just didn't stop long enough to say anything." A hush fell again. not the suffocating tension from earlier. A reflective hush. Marcus typed a final command. The laptop chimed, then fell silent. Everyone waited. A moment later, Samuel's handheld device lit up with new clarity. The main network is responding. He said, "Gate control is restoring operations." A wave of relieved exclamations rippled through the cabin. Someone whispered, "He did it." Another said, "This man just fixed the entire airline." Someone else muttered, "He saved them, even after what they did." Marcus closed the laptop gently and rested his hands on the cover for a breath. "I didn't fix the airline," he said. "I fixed a system. The airline has to fix itself." His words settled on them like gentle rain, slow and cleansing. Helen moved closer. Her voice was unsteady but sincere. "Mr. Gray, I want to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I want to." He looked at her, thoughtful. "Start by telling the truth, and listen when people tell you theirs." She nodded slowly, absorbing the time-worn wisdom hidden beneath those simple words. Samuel spoke cautiously. "We can begin boarding procedures again soon. People will want explanations." Marcus nodded. "They will get them." Jaden's livestream chat exploded again. Words of support poured in from tens of thousands of viewers watching the moment unfold. He glanced at Marcus with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Why are you so calm?" he whispered. Marcus smiled gently. "When you've lived long enough on the receiving end of assumptions, calm becomes a form of survival." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, as though hearing a truth she had carried for decades but never said aloud. Helen stepped forward once more, looking into Marcus's eyes with a sincerity that wasn't there before. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. Not because of the consequences, but because you deserved better from me as a human being." Marcus softened. "Thank you for saying that." She inhaled deeply. "You may not believe this, but I want to learn." "I do believe you," he replied. "Change starts with willingness." Passengers watched the moment unfold with quiet reverence. The cabin lights steadied fully now. The hum returned to its normal tone. Something had shifted in that small space, not just in the airline system, in hearts, in understanding, in the kind of truth that does not vanish after the moment passes. Air traffic notifications appeared on Samuel's device. "Mr. Gray," he said, "headquarters wants to know if they can schedule a call with you tonight." Marcus exhaled softly. "Tell them I'll speak with them. But this conversation won't be about systems. It will be about people." Ruth smiled with warm approval. That's exactly what they need to hear. The passengers nodded as if they were part of something larger than themselves. And for the first time since the conflict began, the cabin felt full. Not crowded. Full. Full of awareness. Full of truth. Full of quiet change. The story was no longer only his. It had become theirs too. The hum inside the aircraft settled into a calm rhythm. But something in the air felt newly awakened. Conversations that earlier carried judgment and discomfort now held reflection. Passengers shifted in a way that suggested they were trying to understand not only what had happened, but what it revealed about them. Marcus remained seated, hands resting lightly on the closed laptop. He kept his posture relaxed, though within him lay a quiet storm of thought. His composure masked a mixture of relief and ache, two emotions that often live together in moments like this. Ruth Campbell watched him with gentle admiration. Her expression carried pride, sorrow, and a deep recognition. She had seen decades of human behavior, and she knew this moment would echo long past the confines of this cabin. Jaden Brooks finally ended the live stream, his hands trembling as he lowered his phone. He sat back in his seat, breath unsteady. The weight of witnessing something real and raw lingered in his chest, leaving him thoughtful in a way he had never experienced before. Samuel Rogers finished reading another update on his handheld device. He approached Marcus with calm steps. Headquarters says the system is fully stabilizing. He reported, "Gate operations expect us to resume boarding shortly." Marcus nodded. "Good." Samuel lingered. "They also asked if you'd consider joining a meeting with their oversight panel." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Tonight?" Samuel nodded. "Tonight." A faint smile touched Marcus's lips. "They must be very eager." "They are," Samuel replied, though the faint humor in his voice didn't hide his underlying concern. They know this was more than a technical issue. Marcus exhaled quietly. "They're right." Helen Morris stood several feet away, shoulders hunched slightly, hands folded in front of her like a student awaiting a difficult conversation. Every now and then, she glanced at Marcus with eyes full of sorrow and humility. She approached slowly, voice catching on the first word. "Mr. Gray, may I speak with you?" He met her gaze with calm patience. "Of course." Helen clasped her hands together as if steadying herself. "I've worked in aviation for almost 2 decades," she said softly. "I've trained hundreds of crew members. I thought I understood people. I thought I understood fairness." Her voice trembled. "But today, I saw parts of myself I didn't want to believe existed." Marcus listened without interruption, allowing her the dignity of speaking her truth. "I thought I was protecting the cabin. I thought I was following procedure. But the truth is, I acted on what I assumed, not on what I knew." Tears formed at the edges of her eyes, though she kept her voice steady. "You handled it with more grace than I deserved." Marcus leaned slightly forward. "Grace is not a favor," he said. "It's a choice. And sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us from becoming what hurt us." Helen inhaled shakily. "I want to learn. I want to be better. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to change." Marcus nodded gently. "Change begins with awareness, and you've taken the first step." Helen lowered her gaze, relief mingling with lingering shame. She stepped back, giving him space once more. Nearby, passengers began to stir with new curiosity. A woman in row 2 leaned closer, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Gray," she said, "may I ask something?" Marcus turned toward her with a neutral expression. "Go ahead." She hesitated, then spoke slowly, as though trying to frame the question with respect. "How do you stay calm when something like this happens? I mean, when someone questions your right to be somewhere." "I don't think I could." Marcus took a moment before answering. He didn't rush. He didn't deflect. "It's not calm." He said softly, "It's endurance. You learn it when you've spent years being told the world wasn't built with you in mind." The woman swallowed. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Marcus said. "But exhaustion doesn't mean surrender. Some of us learn to carry it like a second skin." Jaden listened closely from behind, the words sinking deep. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his tone carrying sincerity. "Sir, I want you to know. I judged you at first. I saw you standing there and assumed you were causing trouble. That's on me. I'm sorry." Marcus nodded. "Thank you for saying it." The man lowered his eyes, humbled. Ruth Campbell smiled faintly, her voice warm and soft. "Sometimes people need their eyes opened," she said. "Sometimes they need a crack in their certainty." She looked at Marcus with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "You didn't just open their eyes, you gave them something to reflect on." Marcus appreciated the kindness, though he felt the familiar ache beneath it. Every lesson he taught came at a personal cost. Every moment of clarity for others meant another wound for him to carry quietly. But he didn't show the ache. He simply held it with the strength he had built over a lifetime. Samuel approached again. "Mr. Gray, the captain would like to meet you before takeoff." Marcus nodded. "I'll speak with him." Jaden leaned forward, voice tentative. "Mr. Gray, do you ever feel angry?" The question came out quietly, almost childlike in its vulnerability. Marcus turned toward him. His reply emerged in a tone layered with truth and gentleness. Anger is natural, he said, but anger doesn't have to lead the way. I let dignity go first. Anger follows behind, where it can't do harm. Jaden absorbed the words like a young tree absorbing its first rainfall. Passengers seemed to sit taller after Marcus spoke. Not because of pride, but because they had heard something that touched the part of them that still hoped to grow. Helen murmured softly to herself, as if rehearsing a promise. I'll remember this. I won't forget. Marcus looked toward the cabin aisle, where faint traces of tension remained like footprints from a storm that had passed but still left marks. He stood, gathering his laptop with silent certainty. His steps were slow and deliberate as he moved toward the front of the cabin to meet the captain. Every eye followed him, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of respect. Ruth whispered with a smile. There goes a man who knows who he is. Jaden adjusted his phone, not to film, but to write something he didn't want to forget. Samuel exchanged a quiet look with Helen, one that held recognition of how deeply the cabin had changed. And as Marcus approached the cockpit door, the aircraft seemed to hold a collective breath, as if aware that the next moments would shape the final chapter of this story. A story no longer about a seat, no longer about a system, a story now about a truth finally seen. Captain Howard Stevens stood waiting near the cockpit entrance. His uniform was immaculate, yet the slight tension in his shoulders suggested he already knew more than he wished he did. As Marcus approached, the captain straightened, offering a respectful nod. Mr. Gray, he said in a steady voice. Thank you for speaking with me. Marcus returned the nod. Of course. Howard gestured toward a quiet corner near the front. They stepped aside, far enough that passengers couldn't hear them, yet close enough that the energy of the cabin still pulsed around them. I want to acknowledge what happened. The captain began, not from corporate pressure or public scrutiny, but from a place of responsibility. I'm the commanding authority on this aircraft. What happens in my cabin is my duty. Marcus observed him carefully. The man's eyes carried sincerity, mixed with the weight of someone learning hard truths. Howard continued, voice low. When I reviewed the preliminary notes from the crew, I saw inconsistencies, procedures that didn't match protocol. But beyond that, I saw something I've spent years trying to uproot whenever I recognized it in myself. He exhaled slowly. Bias. That quiet thing that hides until it harms someone. Marcus didn't speak. He allowed Howard the space to finish. I can't undo the damage, Howard said, but I can make sure it never happens on a flight under my command again. A moment of silence stretched gently between them. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. Captain, Marcus finally replied. Accountability begins exactly like this, with honesty, with the willingness to look inward. Howard nodded once, as if taking an oath. Behind them. The cabin murmured. Passengers shifted, watching with cautious interest. A small part of them seemed curious about what was happening out of earshot. Yet the deeper part understood that whatever was unfolding was bigger than a private conversation. Howard straightened. We'll be ready for departure soon. I wanted to speak with you before we resume. I appreciate that, Marcus said. The captain hesitated for a moment, then added, If you ever want to consult on our internal training programs, I'll be the first to sign the request. Marcus gave a faint smile. We'll see what the future holds. Howard offered a final nod and stepped toward the cockpit. Marcus turned back to the cabin, walking with calm steps that carried a sense of steady purpose. As he returned to his seat, he noticed the shift in the room. Eyes that earlier carried judgment now held something closer to contemplation. Several passengers looked away with quiet embarrassment, while others met his gaze with tentative respect. Jaden Brooks sat upright as Marcus passed by. The young man's expression brimmed with emotions he hadn't yet named. Curiosity, admiration, maybe even guilt. He spoke quietly. Mr. Gray, earlier, when everything was happening, I kept thinking, if I were older, or stronger, or braver, maybe I could have stepped in. I'm sorry I didn't. Marcus paused beside him. Courage isn't measured by interruption, he said gently. It's measured by awareness. You saw something wrong. You questioned it. That matters. Jaden swallowed, absorbing the words as if they carried warmth he hadn't expected. Ruth Campbell smiled from 2 seats away, her eyes soft with affection. You're helping him grow, she whispered. Marcus shook his head slightly. He's doing that himself. Helen Morris remained in her jump seat near the galley. Her breathing steadied as she watched Marcus pass. She placed a hand over her chest, not dramatically, but with a subtle gesture of resolve. The weight of the earlier confrontation lingered in her, but something new had begun to form under it. A commitment, perhaps an awakening. As Marcus settled back into seat 1A, his thoughts drifted inward. The cabin noise softened into a distant hum. He set his laptop beside him but did not open it. Instead, he rested his hands on the armrests, grounding himself. Moments like this often brought conflicting emotions: pride and exhaustion, hope and heaviness. Even the smallest victories carried the echo of past battles. And beneath all of it lay a simple truth he had learned early in life. Silence was never empty. It held stories, burdens, memories. He leaned his head back slightly and allowed himself to breathe more deeply. Ruth watched from across the aisle, sensing the shift in him. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a grandmother's warmth. You carry a heavy load, Mr. Gray. Even when you're calm, I can see it. Marcus opened his eyes. We all carry something. Yes, Ruth said, but some loads should never have been placed on a child to begin with. Her words reached him deeply, brushing against memories he rarely acknowledged. Memories of being told he didn't belong, of being measured by everything but merit, of standing before doors he had every right to open, yet being told they weren't meant for him. He turned slightly toward her. We learn to carry it, and sometimes we learn to put pieces of it down. Ruth nodded gently. And sometimes you help others put theirs down too. Passengers around them listened in silence, pretending not to stare, yet clearly moved. Jaden spoke again, his voice quiet. Mr. Gray, when you shut down the system, were you angry? Marcus hesitated, then answered with honesty. I was tired, he said. Tired of watching countless people go through the same thing. Tired of being polite about pain that never seems to fade. His tone remained controlled, yet there was a softness underneath. A tired truth. Tired doesn't mean defeated, Marcus added. It means the moment arrived when silence no longer protected anyone. Helen lowered her gaze as his words washed over her. They weren't directed at her, but they pierced her understanding more deeply than any reprimand could have. Samuel Rogers stepped forward. Mr. Gray, the crew is ready to close the door. We should be clearing the runway soon. Marcus nodded. Samuel hesitated. Something in his face suggested a question forming behind restraint. What is it? Marcus asked. Samuel looked him directly in the eyes. Would you ever consider speaking to our corporate leadership? Not as a complaint, but as guidance. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Marcus replied after a moment, If they truly want to listen, I'll speak. A quiet sense of relief touched Samuel's features. The aircraft began to prepare for departure. Passengers fastened seatbelts. Overhead bins clicked shut. Engines rumbled softly beneath the floor. Yet a different kind of motion stirred inside the cabin, an invisible movement of thoughts and shifting beliefs, a soft cracking of old assumptions and a slow rebuilding of something more human. Ruth closed her eyes, whispering to herself, Sometimes change begins in the quiet after the storm. Marcus glanced toward the window, where the runway lights shimmered in long lines. For the first time since the confrontation began, He allowed himself to feel a small measure of hope, the kind that didn't erase the pain, but offered a space where healing might grow. And as the engines roared louder, lifting the aircraft toward the sky, the weight inside the cabin eased just enough for everyone to sense it. Not a resolution, not a conclusion, but the beginning of understanding. A beginning strong enough to carry them into the next chapter. The aircraft climbed steadily, engines humming with a rhythm that felt almost meditative. A soft glow from the cabin lights settled over the passengers, casting warm reflections along the aisles. After the pressure of the earlier ordeal, this quiet ascent carried a strange calm, like a breath the entire cabin had been holding finally released. Marcus rested his back against the seat, eyes drifting toward the faint outline of clouds beyond the window. Their gentle shapes floated with an ease he envied. For a moment, the sky looked like a place where no one questioned who belonged, a place without suspicion or judgment, a place where being human was the only requirement. Jaden Brooks sat a few rows behind, leaning forward with both elbows on his knees. He watched the back of Marcus's seat, his expression filled with reflection. Something had shifted in the young man. He seemed older now, not in years but in awareness. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude. A soft tone sounded overhead, followed by Captain Howard Stevens' voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached a stable altitude. We appreciate your patience. Today has brought unexpected challenges, and we are grateful for your composure. We hope the remainder of the flight will be peaceful." His voice held more honesty than formality. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding, others sinking into their seats with a sense of release. Helen Morris walked slowly down the aisle, offering water to passengers. Her movements were careful, intentional, as if she were trying to rebuild trust with each step. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused. "Would you like some water? Mr. Gray?" He nodded. "Thank you." Helen handed him a cup, her voice quiet. "If at any point you'd like to speak with me privately, I'm available." Marcus met her gaze. "I appreciate that." She moved on, though the slight tremor in her hands revealed the weight she continued to carry. Across the aisle, Ruth Campbell opened a small book, smoothing the edges of a worn page. She didn't read. She simply held it, letting the presence of something familiar ground her. Every now and then, she looked toward Marcus with a gentle expression that felt like a kind of prayer. Jaden finally stood up, hesitating before approaching. "Mr. Gray," he said softly, "do you mind if I sit with you for a moment?" Marcus gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Go ahead." Jaden sat down, clasping his hands together. He took a breath before speaking. "When everything happened earlier, I couldn't stop thinking about my grandmother. She used to tell me stories about the things she went through when she was young, places she wasn't allowed to go, people who treated her like she didn't matter." He paused. "I always thought the world was different now." Marcus's voice held warmth. "In many ways, it is. But change isn't a finish line, it's a direction." Jaden nodded slowly. "Seeing you stand there, calm like that, I don't know if I could ever be that strong." Marcus looked at him. "Strength doesn't start with moments like that. It starts with smaller choices. Listening, speaking up, learning what kind of person you want to be." Jaden took this in, eyes softening. "I want to be the kind that helps, not the kind that watches. That's already a powerful beginning," Marcus said. Jaden exhaled, shoulders relaxing. After a moment, he stood. "Thank you for letting me talk," he murmured before returning to his seat. Not far behind, a man in business attire who had earlier muttered harsh comments now sat hunched over, hands clasped, eyes downcast. He seemed to battle with something inside him. Shame. Perhaps recognition. A collision between past beliefs and present truth. He finally stood, approaching Marcus with hesitant steps. "Mr. Gray," he said quietly. Marcus turned slightly. My name is Daniel Hart, the man added. I was one of the people who misjudged you earlier. His throat tightened. I saw a version of myself today that I'm not proud of. A long pause stretched between them. I don't expect anything from you, Daniel said, but I needed you to know I'm going to work on changing the part of me that spoke before understanding. Marcus's response was simple. Thank you for the honesty. Daniel nodded, emotion swelling behind his eyes before he returned to his seat. The cabin grew still once more, though it was a different kind of stillness now. Not fear, not discomfort. Reflection. Samuel Rogers approached, leaning slightly toward Marcus. Anything you need at this moment? He asked. Marcus shook his head. I'm fine. Samuel hesitated. I've been a flight attendant for 15 years, he said. I've learned to read people, to anticipate needs. But today I learned something different. Sometimes the most important thing I can do is look at myself, not just at passengers. Marcus's tone was gentle. Growth is never wasted. Samuel nodded, a quiet gratitude in his expression, before heading toward the galley. Helen returned to her jump seat, breathing steadily. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting truth settle into her bones. She didn't run from it. She let it reshape her. Near the back, two passengers whispered about how they would tell their families what they witnessed. Not the drama, but the awakening. The shift. The way one person's quiet strength had revealed the cracks in a system they never questioned. Ruth looked up, addressing Marcus in a soft voice. People don't forget moments like this, she said. They carry them forward. Sometimes they even pass them on. Marcus gave her a small smile. I hope they carry it in the right direction. Ruth nodded. I believe they will. I count outside the window. The sky stretched in an endless blue expanse. Marcus watched the horizon, feeling an old ache soften into something gentler. The moments of tension had left their mark, yet what lingered now was quieter, fuller. A reminder that even painful experiences could open paths towards something better. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. We'll begin our descent shortly. Please prepare for landing. Passengers straightened, the cabin shifting into a blend of anticipation and calm. Jaden looked toward Marcus once more, as if gathering strength from the sight of him. Helen folded her trembling hands, ready to face what came next with new resolve. Samuel checked seatbelts with a steadiness that carried deeper intention. Daniel Hart sat still, his gaze distant, processing the man he hoped to become. And Ruth Campbell closed her eyes, whispering a silent blessing into the air. Marcus watched the runway appear far below. A quiet truth settled over him. The sky had carried them through conflict. Now the earth waited to see what they would do with what they had learned. The aircraft dipped gently toward the ground, the cabin holding its breath again. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. A landing not just for the plane, but for every heart aboard. The wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, followed by the familiar long glide that signaled the end of a journey. Yet for everyone inside the aircraft, it felt less like an ending and more like a threshold, a line between who they were when the flight began and who they had become by its descent. Marcus kept his eyes on the narrowing strips of tarmac rushing past. His breath stayed steady, though uncertainty pooled quietly beneath his calm. He had dealt with systems far larger than this airline, but there was something uniquely heavy about witnessing people confront their own reflection. The aircraft slowed, engines rumbling down to a low hum. Voices murmured throughout the cabin. Passengers unbuckled their belts and exchanged glances, some tentative, some thoughtful. A deeper understanding had settled among them, as if the air itself carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Captain Howard Stevens spoke over the intercom. Thank you for your patience today. We will taxi to the gate shortly. Please remain seated until the crew releases you. His voice held a subdued gravity, as though he too felt the significance of what had unfolded. Ruth Campbell touched the spine of her book, brushing her thumb along the worn crease. She looked toward Marcus with a soft smile. You've given these people something to remember, she whispered. Something they'll carry far beyond this gate. Marcus nodded slightly. I hope it leads somewhere meaningful. Ruth chuckled quietly. Meaning has a way of finding those who look for it. Behind them? Jaden Brooks leaned back with his hands clasped over his chest. His expression carried a mixture of awe and a new, fragile strength. The kind that grows quietly beneath the surface, where others rarely notice. As the aircraft rolled to its final stop, Helen Morris stood motionless in her jump seat. Her hands were clasped tightly, fingertips pale. The weight of the day still pressed against her chest. Yet she no longer looked lost. She looked resolute, as if she had chosen to walk through the discomfort rather than hide from it. The cabin door opened with a soft click. A team of ground staff waited outside, their faces tense with anticipation. They had been briefed, though none of them knew what the moment would require. Samuel Rogers stepped forward. Mr. Gray, the airline's operations director is waiting for you just outside the jet bridge, he said. She requested to speak with you directly. Marcus inhaled quietly. Very well. Jaden stood quickly, almost instinctively. Do you need someone to walk with you? He asked in a timid voice. Marcus gave him a reassuring smile. I'll be fine. Helen watched him rise. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Before you go, I want to say something. Marcus paused, meeting her gaze. Helen swallowed, steadying herself. I can't change what happened earlier, but I want to make sure that no version of me in any future repeats what I did today. Her voice softened into something more vulnerable, not just because of my job, but because of who I want to be. Marcus nodded. That's the beginning of real change. Helen. She exhaled, relief washing through her. As he turned to exit the cabin, passengers began to rise not to crowd him, but to acknowledge him. Some nodded quietly, some placed hands over their hearts. Others simply held his gaze with silent respect. Daniel Hart, the man who had misjudged him earlier, spoke softly. Thank you for giving people like me a chance to see ourselves honestly. Marcus acknowledged him with a quiet nod. Ruth's voice followed him gently. Walk with dignity. Mr. Gray. You've earned that path. He stepped into the jet bridge, where the mood shifted sharply. The controlled climate of the cabin gave way to a narrow walkway filled with tension. Two uniformed security officers stood nearby, though their posture held alertness rather than hostility. In front of them stood a woman in a tailored navy suit. She carried an air of authority shaped by years of leadership, measured, firm, polished. She stepped forward. Mr. Gray. I'm Evelyn Hartwell, operations director for the airline. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Marcus studied her carefully. Her composure was professional, but her eyes held a deeper urgency. I wasn't given much of a choice, he replied, though his tone remained steady. Evelyn nodded slowly. Fair enough. She took a breath. I reviewed the internal logs and crew reports. What happened to you was unacceptable. It violated policy, ethics, and basic human respect. I want you to know that we are taking immediate action. Marcus waited. Evelyn continued. The system outage forced an emergency executive session. Corporate leadership is preparing a public statement. But I wanted to speak with you personally first. Her voice softened. I need to understand what justice looks like to you, not in a press release, but here, face to face. Her sincerity was difficult to ignore. Yet Marcus had spent years watching companies hide behind appearances. He was careful with his trust. Justice, he said slowly, isn't about apologies. It isn't about firing someone to quiet the public. Justice is about changing the space where the harm was allowed to grow. Evelyn held his gaze. What would that look like? In your eyes? Marcus paused. He wasn't speaking only for himself now. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated as though their right to dignity required a second opinion. It looks like accountability, he said. Meaningful, not symbolic. It looks like admitting not only what happened, but why it happened, and changing the systems that made it possible. Evelyn absorbed his words. She glanced briefly at the officers, then back at him. "You're right," she said softly, "and we need help to do that." Marcus remained quiet. "We want you to lead an advisory committee on reform," she said. "Not to shield us, but to guide us. We want to rebuild trust, and we want you to help shape the way forward." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He allowed silence to sit between them, not as resistance, but as reflection. He knew the weight such a role carried. He also knew what could be achieved if it was done honestly. "I'll consider it," he said at last. "But I won't be a figurehead. If I participate, it will be with full transparency and authority." Evelyn nodded. "That's exactly what we want." Behind Marcus, the sound of soft footsteps approached. Ruth Campbell emerged from the jet bridge entrance, leaning on her cane as she walked toward him. "Mr. Gray," she said gently, "don't forget that justice is heavy work. Make sure you leave enough room in your hands to carry hope as well." Marcus felt something settle quietly inside him, a reminder that even difficult change required grace to sustain it. He turned to Evelyn. "I'll attend your leadership meeting tonight," he said. "We'll discuss everything there." Evelyn exhaled, relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Gray." Marcus cast one final glance back toward the aircraft, where faces still watched from the open door. People who had arrived with complacency, people who would leave with new understanding. The sky had revealed something in them. Now the ground would decide what they did with it, and as he stepped forward with measured strides, the path ahead felt uncertain, but filled with possibility. Not for him alone, but for everyone touched by the truth that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. The conference center at the airport wasn't designed for moments of reckoning. Yet when Marcus stepped inside, the air carried the unmistakable feeling that something significant was about to unfold. The space was large enough to hold 100 people, though only 15 chairs were arranged in a circle at the center of the room. A deliberate choice, meant to remove hierarchy and soften distance. Evelyn Hartwell guided Marcus to a seat. Her posture was measured, but the faint tension around her eyes revealed she was bracing for what the meeting might reveal. Several executives filtered into the room, each carrying tablets and folders, though their confidence seemed thinner than usual. The system outage had stripped away the illusion of control they once relied on. Now they entered the room like people stepping into a storm they could no longer ignore. Marcus sat quietly, allowing them to enter without acknowledging him first. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Some avoided his eyes, others nodded politely, but every one of them felt the truth stretching across the room like a taut wire. When all seats were filled, Evelyn cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Today's agenda concerns the events on Flight 227, the system vulnerability exposed by the Sigma protocol, and the immediate measures needed to rebuild public trust." She paused, glancing at Marcus before continuing. "We invited Mr. Gray not only because of his role in today's outage, but because the incident revealed systemic issues we can no longer overlook." A low murmur drifted through the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably. Marcus sat straighter, hands resting calmly on his knees. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and unhurried. "I'm not here to reprimand anyone. I'm here because silence is often the fuel behind injustice. What happened on that plane happened not because of a single individual, but because a system allowed it. Systems don't change until the people running them decide to face the truth." The room absorbed his words in thick silence. A tall man in a charcoal suit, the head of crew operations, leaned forward. "Mr. Gray, I want to be clear, and we take discrimination very seriously. Our training modules include diversity, equity, and respectful communication. This incident, it doesn't reflect our values." Marcus lifted his gaze, and the man's voice faltered. "Values," Marcus replied softly, "are only as real as the behavior they produce. You can hand out as many training slides as you want, but if your employees don't feel accountable for how they treat passengers, the training isn't working." Another executive, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, had spoke up. We reviewed Helen Morris's record. She has no prior complaints. This was unexpected. Marcus held her gaze. Bias doesn't need a history to exist. It only needs permission. The woman's breath caught quietly. Evelyn stepped in. Mr. Gray, what do you propose? Marcus let a moment of silence settle before answering. 3 things. His voice remained steady, yet there was a firmness beneath it. First, truth. You cannot address what you refuse to name. The airline must acknowledge, publicly and internally, that the events on Flight 227 revealed a failure in culture, not just protocol. Several executives shifted, discomfort tightening their posture. Second, Marcus continued, accountability, not only for Helen Morris, but for everyone responsible for shaping the environment she operated in. A younger manager frowned. Are you suggesting disciplinary action for leadership? Marcus answered without raising his voice. I'm suggesting responsibility. You can't fire your way out of systemic problems, but you can confront the parts of leadership that allow those problems to thrive. The room fell into contemplative silence. Third, Marcus said, transformation, not cosmetic changes or rushed training, a full cultural rebuild, new reporting systems, independent oversight, and most importantly, continuous reflection. One executive cleared his throat. That's a massive undertaking. Marcus nodded. So is maintaining the dignity of the people who trust you with their lives each time they board a flight. The words landed with quiet force. Evelyn folded her hands. Miss Gray, your perspective is invaluable, but we need your guidance to shape these reforms. Would you be willing to help us build the new framework? The executives waited, some anxious, others hopeful. Marcus leaned back slightly. I will help, he said, but only if the commitment is real. I won't attach my name to something that exists only for public approval. Evelyn nodded. Understood. A moment of unexpected vulnerability passed through the room. The kind that comes when people realize they are standing at the doorway between who they were and who they must become. The older woman spoke again, softer this time. Mr. Gray, may I ask you something personal? Marcus gave a small nod. When you were standing in that cabin, surrounded by judgment, what kept you calm? Marcus took a breath. His eyes drifted briefly toward the floor before lifting again. I remembered being told I didn't belong long before today, he said quietly. In school? In boardrooms? In places where I had every right to stand. You learn to choose dignity, not because it's easy, but because it's the only thing no one can take from you. No one spoke. Even the air felt still, carrying the weight of truths people avoided for years. When the meeting paused for a break, Evelyn approached Marcus privately. There's something you should know, she said. We ran a full system audit during the outage. We discovered several internal reports filed over the past 2 years. Complaints involving cases similar to what happened to you. Marcus's expression tightened, though he didn't look surprised. Why weren't they addressed? Evelyn hesitated. They were minimized, categorized as miscommunication or passenger misunderstanding. Marcus inhaled slowly. That tells you everything you need to know. Evelyn nodded, which is why I intend to reopen every single one of those cases. Marcus studied her carefully. She didn't flinch. Good, he said softly. A knock came at the door. A communications manager poked her head inside. Ms. Hartwell, the media is requesting a statement. They're asking if Mr. Gray will accompany you. A ripple of tension moved through the room. Evelyn turned to Marcus. Would you be willing? Marcus paused. He weighed the moment carefully, feeling both its burden and its opportunity. I'll stand beside you, he said, but I won't repeat prepared talking points. I will speak the truth. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed. That's exactly what we need. As they walked toward the press room, voices stirred behind them, executives whispering, reflecting, questioning themselves in ways they never had before. Marcus moved with steady steps, the kind that came from years of walking through spaces that tried to shrink him. Ruth's words echoed in his mind. Leave room in your hands for hope. He held on to that. Not because he trusted the system, but because he believed in the possibility of people learning. He entered the press room, facing a sea of cameras and waiting voices. A room ready to hear truth. A room that, for the first time in a long time, felt ready to listen. The press room filled with the warm hum of equipment warming up. Lights pointed toward the central podium like watchful eyes. Reporters gathered with notebooks in hand, preparing to dissect every sentence that would soon leave the stage. There was tension, but also an unmistakable pull, as if everyone sensed something rare was about to unfold. Evelyn Hartwell stepped up first. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, though her voice carried a steadiness that grounded the room instantly. Thank you all for coming, she began. Today was a defining moment for our airline, one that revealed painful truths we must face with honesty and purpose. She paused, drawing in a breath before continuing. What happened to Mr. Marcus Gray on Flight 227 was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a failure of respect, a failure of awareness, and a failure of leadership. For that, we take full responsibility. The reporters murmured, pens racing across pages. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward Marcus, who waited quietly to her right. The presence he carried wasn't loud, but it drew attention with the force of conviction alone. I invited Mr. Gray to join this conference, Evelyn said, because his voice must be heard not as a victim of the event, but as a leader whose insight will guide our transformation. She stepped aside. All eyes turned toward Marcus. He approached the podium slowly, hands relaxed at his sides, posture steady. The kind of steady built not by ease, but by years of navigating spaces that questioned him before he spoke. The room quieted so completely that even the faint hum of the cameras seemed to soften. Marcus rested both hands lightly on the sides of the podium. He didn't clear his throat or adjust his notes. He simply lifted his gaze to meet the room. I didn't come here to shame anyone, he began, voice low and warm. I came here because silence often allows harm to grow unnoticed. The reporters leaned forward. What happened on Flight 227 wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about policy or misunderstanding. It was about a deeper issue of belief many people carry without realizing it. The belief that some individuals must be proven worthy of respect, while others are given it freely. A quiet shiver moved through the crowd. I've spent most of my life navigating spaces where my presence was questioned. Marcus continued. Boardrooms, universities, neighborhoods, flights, places I had earned my right to stand, yet still found myself having to justify that right. He paused, letting the weight settle. On that plane, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Not because I lacked anger, but because I chose dignity instead. Dignity is not silence. Dignity is steadiness in the face of doubt. A reporter near the front lowered her pen slowly, eyes locked on him. I want to be clear, Marcus said. I didn't activate the Sigma protocol to punish anyone. I triggered it because systems often ignore problems until those problems make themselves impossible to overlook. He glanced toward Evelyn briefly. Today, the system stopped. And because it stopped, everyone was forced to look. Another pause. Look at what happened. Look at why it happened. Look at who we are allowing ourselves to become. Evelyn lowered her gaze, visibly moved. Marcus continued, voice deepening with sincerity. This company has a chance to rebuild something important, not just infrastructure, but culture. Not just policy, but purpose. That work will take discomfort. It will take humility. It will take consistency. His tone softened. And I am willing to help. Not because I owe this company my time, but because passengers deserve better. Crew members deserve better. And people who walk through this world with skin like mine deserve better. He stepped back for a moment, as if deciding whether to open a more personal thought. Then he allowed himself. When I was a child, my father told me something. He said, "Son, there will be rooms you enter where they've already decided who you are before you speak. Your job is not to fight for their approval, Essa. Your job is to make your presence undeniable." Marcus's gaze swept the room. That is what I did today. A single flash from a camera blinked in the corner, but no one else moved. And now, he said softly, it's time for this airline to decide what kind of presence it wants to have in the world. He stepped back from the podium. The room remained silent for a moment, not out of confusion, but out of reverence. Reporters simply looked at him, some with softened expressions, others with awe, and a few with something close to humility. Then the questions flooded in. "Mr. Gray, do you believe the airline can truly change? Do you intend to pursue legal action? What message do you hope the public takes from your experience? Will you be working with the airline long term? What would justice look like now?" Evelyn signaled for quiet, but Marcus raised a hand gently before she intervened. "I'll answer one thing." He said, "Justice isn't revenge. Justice is growth. If this airline grows from today, we have all gained something." His voice held a quiet conviction that made the reporters lower their microphones. There was nothing more to demand. The truth he offered was already complete. Evelyn returned to the podium. "Thank you. Mr. Gray, we will be announcing new policies soon. For now, we ask for privacy as we commit to the work ahead." The conference concluded. Marcus stepped away from the lights, the heat of them fading from his skin. The hallway outside felt cooler, quieter. Evelyn joined him. "Your words," she said softly, "they will be remembered." Marcus nodded. "I didn't want them to be loud. I wanted them to land." "They did," Evelyn replied. As they walked toward the exit, a small figure emerged from the corner of the corridor. Jaden Brooks. His eyes were wide, his expression filled with reverence that bordered on disbelief. "Mr. Gray," he said quietly, "I watched the whole thing. I've never heard anyone speak like that." Marcus placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "One day, you'll speak your own truth," he said, "and someone else will say the same thing about you." Jaden blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. Ruth Campbell approached from behind him, leaning on her cane. "You held the room without raising your voice," she said warmly. "That's a rare gift." "Sometimes," Marcus replied, "the voice rises more powerfully when it doesn't need to rise in volume." Ruth smiled. "And sometimes the world listens when it finally meets someone worth listening to." Marcus continued toward the exit door, feeling the weight of the day settle into a quieter place within him. The crisis was no longer in the sky. The work was now on the ground, and tomorrow would test whether change would stay only in words or become something real. The sun hung low beyond the glass walls of the airport as Marcus stepped outside, leaving behind the intense lights of the press room. The sky wore a soft amber glow, stretching gently across the horizon. It was the kind of light that made everything feel quieter, as if the world had paused to listen to its own heartbeat. He stood still for a moment, taking in the cool air. The weight of the day pressed gently against his shoulders, not heavy enough to crush him, but firm enough to remind him that truth had a cost. Yet within that weight was a strange sense of peace, not victory, not relief, something deeper, something earned. Footsteps approached behind him. It was Evelyn Hartwell. She stopped at his side, her voice low and sincere. "You changed something today, Mr. Gray. More than I expected. More than I think any of us expected." Marcus didn't look at her right away. Change only begins when people allow themselves to see. Evelyn nodded. "And when someone has the courage to show them?" For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed her voice to tremble. "I want you to know that this is not going to be a public gesture and nothing more. I meant what I said about rebuilding the culture. Whatever it takes. However uncomfortable it becomes." Marcus studied her expression. The sincerity was unmistakable, a quiet determination anchored in humility. "Then you'll succeed," he said softly. "Not because you avoid mistakes, but because you're willing to face them." Evelyn's eyes softened. She extended her hand not as a corporate formality, but as a human gesture. "Thank you, Marcus." He shook her hand. "We start soon." She nodded and stepped back inside the terminal, leaving him alone once more. Marcus turned toward the parking area where the fading sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Before he could take another step, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. It was Jaden Brooks, running toward him with uneven breaths, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mr. Gray," he said, stopping in front of him, trying to catch his breath. Marcus smiled at the sight of him. "Jaden, what brings you out here?" Jaden looked up with an earnestness that made him seem older than his years. I wanted to thank you, not for the live stream or the things people online are saying, but for what you told me, about strength, about choices." He clenched his fists lightly. "I didn't understand those things before today." Marcus placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You understood them. You just needed a moment big enough to bring them to the surface." Jaden's eyes glistened. "I won't forget this." "You shouldn't," Marcus replied. "The world becomes better when someone decides to remember." Jaden gave a small nod and stepped back, emotion tightening his throat. After a final glance of gratitude, he turned and walked toward the terminal entrance. A few yards away, Ruth Campbell stood near a bench, watching them with a tender smile. Marcus hadn't seen her there, but she approached with quiet steps. "You handled that boy with grace," she said. "He just needed to be seen." Marcus replied. Ruth nodded. "Most people do. Some spend their entire lives waiting for a moment like that." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You know, Mr. Gray, I've lived long enough to measure a person not by the noise they make, but by the silence they fill. Today, you filled silence with truth." Marcus lowered his gaze, humbled. "I didn't do it alone, no," Ruth said. "But you were the one who stood steady. And sometimes that's enough to begin a new path." Marcus offered her his arm to help steady her steps as they walked toward the exit. She accepted with a grateful smile. "Will you take good care of yourself?" Ruth asked gently. "I'll try," Marcus said. She chuckled softly. "Try with intention." He helped her to a waiting car, and she gave his hand a final squeeze before she left. The door closed, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the slow flow of airport traffic. Marcus stood still again, watching until the car became a small blur in the distance. He exhaled, feeling the day catch up to him. Moments later, another figure approached from behind. Daniel Hart. The man's posture lacked the confident arrogance he carried earlier. He walked slowly, hands clasped in front of him, as if still processing everything that had changed within him. "Mr. Gray," he said quietly. "I didn't want to leave without saying something." Marcus turned to face him. "I saw a version of myself today that I'm not proud of." Daniel paused, searching for words. "I want to be better than that. My wife, my daughter, they deserve someone better than that." Marcus listened with calm patience. "Being better doesn't start with perfection," he said. "It starts with truth. And you've already taken the first step." Daniel looked down for a moment before meeting Marcus's eyes again. "Thank you," he whispered. He walked away slowly, leaving the words hanging in the air like an unfinished promise. Marcus watched him go, then finally turned toward the quiet space beyond the curb. His driver waited by a black sedan, door open, engine humming faintly. Before stepping in, Marcus lifted his gaze to the sky. A single aircraft cut through the amber light above, rising steadily into the open expanse. Its tail glimmered like a small promise carried on wind. He felt the echo of the day settle deeply within him. the tension, the awakening, the turning point. He knew the work ahead would not be simple, change never was. But he also knew something important. The world had listened today. And once the world listens, even a little, it becomes harder for it to pretend it didn't hear. He placed a hand on the car door, hesitated for a moment as if gathering a final thought, then finally slid into the seat. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Marcus looked through the window one more time. The airport glowed beneath the fading sun, casting long shadows and soft light across the rooflines. It reminded him of something his father once said. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down beside you, and waits to see what you choose to do next. Marcus leaned back in his seat, letting those words drift through him. The road ahead stretched open, long and steady, a path not toward triumph, but toward purpose, toward healing, toward change that would ripple far beyond what happened on Flight 227. And as the city skyline emerged in the distance, glowing gently against the dimming sky, Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. Not to rest, not to retreat, but to carry hope forward. A hope earned, a hope shared, a hope ready to begin again. The story of Marcus Gray is more than just an incident on a plane. It mirrors a journey that many people go through, being judged before being heard, doubted before being understood. What makes it so memorable is not just the injustice, but how he chose to face it. Marcus did not choose anger, even though he had every reason to. He chose calm. He chose to hold on to his dignity, even when others tried to take it away. He demonstrated that true strength lies not in reacting loudly, but in the ability to hold on to your values when challenged. The biggest lesson here is sometimes to change something. We do not need violence, we do not need noise, we need steadfastness, we need a clear voice, and we need the courage to step into the truth, even when it hurts. Older people will understand better than anyone there are times in life when we have to stand up, not to prove ourselves right, but to keep the world around us a little better for the next generation. Hopefully this story helps each of us remember that kindness, truth, and self-respect can always open new doors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to a profound story about people, dignity, and change. If this story makes you think, reminds you of the paths you have traveled, please leave a like, share the video so that many others can touch this message, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to accompany us in the next stories. Your support is the motivation for us to continue telling meaningful stories.